All right, guys, today we are going to cover topic 2.6, right? 2.6 is real versus nominal GDP. In this video, we're going to cover the difference between real and nominal GDP, and then we're going to cover the GDP deflator, all right? So let's first let's first explain the difference between real and nominal GDP. Real GDP is going to equate for inflation, while nominal GDP does not equate for inflation. So if you're looking at like a year, right, just 1 year, then you would use the nominal value. But when you're looking at a set of years, right, so from like 1980 to 2000, right, you want nominal GDP, you want real GDP so that it has inflation included. So your numbers represent the actual values or the value that is there. So let's look at some examples and some stuff that kind of might help us out here. So adjusting for inflation. So if a country's GDP increased from 4 billion to 5 billion in 1 year, is the country experiencing economic growth? So we want to know, there's a few things that could be happening, right? They could be producing more of that, more products, right? So that might see the additional billion in GDP. Or it could be that price levels have increased, right? So if price levels have increased and they're producing the same amount, then they are not experiencing economic growth, right? So you can look at let's look at apples, for example. So in the first year, if all our country did was produce apples, right, and that's how we generate our GDP is the production of apples, right? So we in the first year, our apples tree, right, in our country was only able to produce 10 apples, and we sold those apples for $1 each. Well, our GDP would be $10, right? And so the second year, right, same apple tree, right? Everything's the same. It only produced, again, 10 apples. And so this time, instead of selling the apples for $1, we sold it for $1.25. So there was inflation, right? There's a quarter of inflation there's a quarter of inflation in our example. So now our GDP, instead of being $10, is $12.50, right? So is the country doing better since the GDP is higher? Well, yes, the GDP is higher, which is good, but the country is actually worse off, right? Because you're not producing more, right? You're not seeing real economic growth. You're producing the same amount, right? So again, nominal GDP is GDP measured in current prices and does not account for inflation from year to year, while real GDP is expressed in constant or unchanging dollars, right? And this is going to adjust for inflation. So real GDP is a better way of looking at GDP, right? Than nominal GDP for measuring actual growth, right? Like if we just want to know the GDP for 2020, that's fine. But if we want to see, are we actually growing, then you have to use real, because you have to see, is the prices is GDP increasing due to inflation, or is GDP increasing because of more economic growth, right? All right, so we're going to look at CPI versus the GDP deflator, right? And so the GDP deflator measures the prices of all goods produced, whereas the CPI measures prices of only goods and services bought by consumers. So GDP, remember, covers consumer spending, business investment, government spending, and net exports. And CPI is the market basket, right? So it's only going to look at C, right? So an increase in prices. So CPI is going to tell us is there inflation occurring, right? But GDP deflator is going to tell us, is going to deflate or take out the inflation, right? Deflate the GDP. So increase in prices of goods bought by a firm or the government will show up in the GDP deflator, but it's not going to show up in the CPI, right? The GDP deflator includes only goods and services produced domestically. Imported goods are not part of the GDP and therefore don't show up in the GDP deflator, right? So how do we get the GDP deflator, right? It's very simple, right? Again, we're going to do a division. We're going to take nominal, right? Over real. Multiply that by 100, and that's going to equal the deflator, right? So you take the nominal value, divide that by real, multiply that by 100, and that's going to give you the GDP deflator. Now, there's the GDP deflator, and then, again, you can use algebra to kind of move this equation around, right? You guys are pretty sharp in being able to do that, but I want to just show you real quick nominal GDP, how we can get nominal GDP. So nominal GDP would be the deflator times real over 100. And that's going to give you, I don't know if you guys can, there you go. And that's going to give you the nominal GDP, right? So here's the equation for the GDP deflator. Here's the equation for nominal GDP. And that's going to be it for this video. So appreciate you guys. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys later. Thanks.